Hello and welcome to another marvelous video. I'm your host Will. When people first saw the film Pitch Black in theaters, they loved it. But when they saw the sequel, they didn't much care for it. Why is that? Well, in this video, we're gonna go over the facts of the Riddick franchise. Let's get to it.
Hey guys, welcome back. Back in the year 2000, a weird little sci-fi horror movie called Pitch Black quietly showed up in theaters with almost no expectations behind it. It neither had a huge marketing campaign, nor was it based on some famous comic book. And it wasn't even like it was trying to launch some billion-dollar cinematic universe. It was just a dark survival movie about a crashed spaceship, a planet full of monsters, and a dangerous criminal called Richard B. Riddick, who is played by Vin Diesel. But somehow, against all odds, this low-budget movie ended up creating one of the coolest original science fiction characters of the modern era. And honestly, this should have been the beginning of a huge sci-fi franchise. Instead, the Riddick series spent over 20 years stuck between cult status, studio misfires, cancelled plans, and development hell. So, without further ado, let's take a look at what actually happened to the Chronicles of Riddick franchise. Pitch Black, the cult beginning. So, Pitch Black was made for around $23 million and ended up making about $53 million worldwide. That might not sound very huge today, but for a gritty R-rated sci-fi horror film with no proper built-in audience, that was a very solid success. More importantly, the movie absolutely exploded on DVD and home video afterwards. That is where Riddick really found his audience. People kept discovering the movie late at night on cable television or renting the DVD from stores back when video rental stores still existed. And the reason people kept coming back to it wasn't just because of the monsters. It was because of Riddick himself. Riddick immediately started feeling different from most action heroes at that time. He was not noble, he wasn't even trying to save the world, and he wasn't even pretending to be a good person. He was simply a violent convict with surgically altered eyes that allowed him to see in the dark. And the movie constantly made you question whether he was going to help the survivors or kill them the second it started benefiting him. That uncertainty was what made him so interesting, and that tension in Pitch Black worked because you genuinely did not know whose side he was actually on. The premise itself was so brilliantly simple. A transport ship crashes onto a desert planet with 3 suns, which means the world is almost always covered in daylight. But eventually, a rare eclipse happens, and once darkness arrives, terrifying creatures hidden beneath the surface also finally show up. These creatures can only hunt in the dark, which suddenly makes Riddick the most valuable person on the planet because he's the only one who can fully see once the lights go out. Director David Twohy kept everything very small and focused. The movie was basically survival horror mixed with sci-fi tension. It was dirty, mean, claustrophobic, and stripped down in a way that made danger feel very real. Vin Diesel also gave a remarkable star-making performance here. Long before Fast and Furious became one of the biggest franchises in Hollywood, Pitch Black was the movie that proved Diesel carried real screen presence. He barely even needed dialogue. The voice, the posture, the way he moved through scenes like an animal studying prey, all of it made Riddick feel instantly iconic. And to be honest, this should have been the beginning of a very cool sci-fi franchise. The character was cool, the movie made money, and fans absolutely loved it. Critics were mixed rather than universally positive, but Universal Pictures suddenly had something pretty valuable on its hands. But the strange thing about the Riddick franchise was that almost every single step after Pitch Black became a fight over scale, over budget, over creative direction, and eventually over whether the franchise should even exist at all. Because after the surprise success of Pitch Black, Universal decided they did not want another small survival movie. They wanted a giant sci-fi epic, and that decision completely changed the trajectory of the entire franchise. The Chronicles of Riddick, the big swing. In 2004, The Chronicles of Riddick arrived, And this movie was an absolutely huge swing compared to Pitch Black. The budget reportedly jumped to around $105 million, which was more than 4 times larger than the original film. And instead of another contained survival story, the sequel suddenly transformed Riddick into the center of a huge conflict involving prophecy, ancient mythology, planetary politics, and a religious military empire called the Necromongers. And this wasn't just a sequel anymore. At this point, David Twohy was trying to build an entire sci-fi universe, and to be honest, the ambition itself wasn't the problem. In fact, one of the most frustrating things about the Chronicles of Riddick was that you could clearly see the version of the franchise it wanted to become. Twohy was aiming for something huge, something close to Dune or classic space opera storytelling. Entire religions, histories, political systems, and strange alien cultures were suddenly introduced into the universe. Riddick himself went from being a dangerous survivor into something almost mythological. The problem was that the audience, expecting another Pitch Black, was suddenly hit with a giant wall of lore and exposition. The tonal shift was huge. Pitch Black was lean and tense, and on the other hand, Chronicles was huge, loud, and overloaded with mythology. Some fans loved the ambition, while other people were completely confused by it. And financially, the movie ended up becoming a disappointment. The Chronicles of Riddick grossed around $115 million worldwide against a reported budget at around $105 million. Before marketing costs were even included. That meant the movie was unlikely to be profitable from its theatrical run alone. Critics were mostly negative, and a lot of viewers felt the movie had become too bloated and complicated compared to the stripped-down horror energy of Pitch Black. But this is where the story got more complicated, because even many people who defended Chronicles today admit that the theatrical version was not the best version of the movie. The director's cut added important scenes and character material that made the mythology easier to understand. A lot of fans who revisit the director's cut today actually think it's a much stronger film than the version audiences originally saw in theaters. That distinction mattered, because the Chronicles of Riddick was not really a story about a filmmaker simply failing. It was more of a story about a studio trying to force a huge franchise expansion before the franchise itself was stable enough to support it. Universal wanted its own huge sci-fi property, but the audience for Riddick was still built mostly on cult fandom and DVD sales. That foundation simply was not strong enough for a $100 million plus gamble, and the consequences were immediate. The larger plans for the franchise had basically collapsed overnight. Sequels that had been discussed suddenly disappeared. Universal lost confidence in expensive Riddick movies, and for a while, it genuinely looked like the franchise was over. But strangely enough, this was also the period where the Riddick universe proved it actually had one of the most loyal fan bases in sci-fi, because while the movie stalled, the franchise started expanding into other media in ways that fans really loved. The games and Dark Fury kept Riddick alive. In 2004, the same year Chronicles released, a video game called The Chronicles of Riddick: Escape from Butcher Bay came out, and somehow, against all odds, it ended up becoming one of the greatest licensed video games ever made. Most movie tie-in games are terrible, but Butcher Bay was different. Instead of lazily copying scenes from the film, the game actually expanded Riddick's backstory with an original prison escape story that perfectly captured the tone of the character. Vin Diesel returned to voice Riddick himself, and the game mixed stealth, combat, horror, and first-person action in a way that really wowed critics. Even today, people talk about Butcher Bay as one of the best examples of how to properly adapt a movie character into gaming. And then, in 2009, another game called Assault on Dark Athena expanded the story even further. The franchise also received an animated short film called The Chronicles of Riddick: Dark Fury, directed by Peter Chung, the creator of Aeon Flux. The short acted as a bridge between Pitch Black and Chronicles, while leaning heavily into the weird sci-fi style that the universe was developing. And to be honest, this part of the franchise history mattered because it proved something important. Riddick was never rejected as a character. Fans consistently showed up for him, and the games were critically respected too. This showed that people kept revisiting the movies and that the franchise clearly had an audience. The real problem was that Hollywood could never actually figure out what scale the franchise should exist at. Was Riddick supposed to be a gritty cult anti-hero inside smaller survival stories? Or was he supposed to lead giant sci-fi epics filled with mythology and world building? The franchise spent over 20 years struggling with that exact question.
Ahead of the sun.
There's gonna be one speed.
Vin Diesel refused to let Riddick die. And then we get into the most insane chapter in the entire story. After Chronicles underperformed, Universal basically had no interest in spending another fortune on Riddick. The franchise looked commercially toxic from a studio perspective, but Vin Diesel refused to let the character die. And this is where things became genuinely unusual for Hollywood. Instead of walking away, Diesel personally fought to bring Riddick back on screen. He reportedly traded a cameo appearance in The Fast and the Furious Tokyo Drift in exchange for obtaining the rights to the Riddick character from Universal. Then he and David Twohy spent years trying to put together another movie, but nobody was really willing to finance it. Eventually, Diesel became so personally invested in making another Riddick film that he literally put his own house at risk to help get the movie made. In an interview with a Hollywood Reporter in August 2013, Vin Diesel said, "I had to leverage my house. If we didn't finish the film, I would be homeless." And this is an absolutely wild thing to say for a major Hollywood star, because this wasn't some tiny independent filmmaker risking everything on their first project. It was Vin Diesel, who was already one of the biggest action stars in the world by this point, thanks to Fast and Furious, and yet he still cared enough about Riddick to gamble his own financial stability on the character, and that level of commitment is extremely rare. Riddick 2013, back to basics. And honestly, the fascinating thing was that Riddick from 2013 would immediately prove that Diesel and Twohy understood exactly what the franchise needed. The movie stripped everything back down. No giant politics, no overwhelming mythology dumps, no trying to compete with Star Wars. The budget dropped all the way down to around $38 million, and the story basically returned to the pitch black formula. Riddick was betrayed, abandoned on a hostile alien planet, and forced to survive against terrifying creatures while dangerous mercenaries hunted him down. And that was it. And it worked. The movie made around $98 million worldwide against its much smaller budget, which made it the most commercially efficient Riddick movie since the original Pitch Black. Critics were more positive than they were towards Chronicles, and fans generally appreciated the return to the survival horror tone. David Twohy had also openly explained the deliberate back-to-basics approach. In interviews around the film's release, he talked about wanting to bring the franchise back to its roots after the massive scale of Chronicles. You could absolutely feel that mindset throughout the movie, and Riddick once again felt dangerous and isolated instead of being treated like a galaxy-saving messiah. And honestly, that may be the biggest lesson the franchise kept relearning over and over again. Riddick worked best when the story stayed focused on survival tension and the character himself, because Riddick was not really interesting as a chosen one. He was interesting as a predator. The appeal of the character came from watching him trapped inside impossible situations and figuring out brutal ways to survive. That was the core identity of the franchise, and every time the series moved too far away from that, things became unstable. But even though Riddick in 2013 was financially successful relative to its budget, the franchise still never fully regained momentum. And that brings us to the next WTF moment, the fourth movie. Riddick Furia, and a long development hell. For over a decade, fans kept hearing updates about another sequel called Riddick Furia, and this movie sounded incredibly important because Furia was Riddick's home planet. It had been referenced throughout the franchise for years, but had never actually been shown on screen. This was supposed to be the movie that finally explored where Riddick came from and why the Furians mattered so much. But the project kept getting stuck again, and the reasons were honestly pretty understandable. First, Universal still never fully regained confidence in large-scale Riddick movies after the financial disappointment of Chronicles. Even though Riddick 2013 succeeded, it succeeded specifically because it stayed relatively cheap. But Furia likely required a much larger scale, because you cannot finally reveal the mysterious homeworld of the Furians and keep the entire movie confined to one tiny desert set with 6 characters. Second, Vin Diesel's schedule became more and more tied up with the Fast and Furious franchise throughout the 2010s. Every time Furia seemed close to moving forward, scheduling conflicts appeared. Third, the project entered that horrible Hollywood phase known as development hell, where movies kept getting announced without fully materializing. Fans kept hearing updates for years that a script was being written, then rewritten, then apparently finished. Then production was supposedly closed, but then it was delayed again. At one point, people genuinely stopped believing that the movie would ever happen, but then surprisingly, the story finally changed. In February 2023, the movie was officially announced again, with David Twohy returning as the writer and director. In a statement reported by Entertainment Weekly, Twohy said, "Our Legion fans have demanded it for years, and now we're finally ready to honor their call to action with Riddick Furia." He also added, "This new big screen event will see a return to Riddick's homeworld, where we finally get to explore Riddick's genesis." Furia's current status. And then, in May 2024, Variety and Deadline confirmed that production for Riddick Furia was scheduled to begin on August 26, 2024, with filming planned across Germany, Spain, and the UK. That was important because, for the first time in years, the project finally moved beyond vague announcements and toward actual production. International pre-sales were reportedly completed through rocket science. David Twohy returned to direct, and Vin Diesel came back as Riddick. But this was also where people had to stay realistic. Because production is scheduled, or even production has started, does not automatically mean that the movie is definitely releasing soon. As of the latest reliable reporting, there is still no confirmed North American distributor attached to the film, and no official release date has been announced. This franchise had also announced progress before, and then gone silent for years. So while Furia is clearly further along than it had been in a very long time, there is still uncertainty surrounding what the final release strategy will even look like. And honestly, that uncertainty perfectly summarizes the entire history of the Riddick franchise, because nothing about this series has ever been stable. Pitch Black was just a scrappy cult hit. Chronicles was an overambitious blockbuster gamble. Riddick was a smaller survival comeback, financed partly through Vin Diesel risking his own house. And Furia has spent more than a decade trying to reach the screen. This franchise could never really build consistent momentum the way other sci-fi franchises did, because it constantly kept resetting itself. And that is honestly frustrating, because there really was potential for something way bigger here. Even today, the Chronicles of Riddick remains fascinating, specifically because of how ambitious it was trying to be. The movie genuinely wanted to create a huge sci-fi mythology with the scale of something like Doom, and that ambition was not really stupid. The timing and execution were the problem. The franchise tried to become massive before the audience fully understood what it even was. And because Chronicles failed financially, the larger mythology never had the opportunity to fully develop across multiple films the way franchises like Star Wars or The Matrix did. Instead, everything became fragmented. One survival horror film, one giant space opera, one stripped-down comeback, 2 major games, 1 animated short, and years of development delays. It felt less like a clean franchise and more like a constant struggle to keep the character alive. And honestly, that may be why Riddick still has such passionate fans. People could feel how much effort went into preserving this franchise. It is very evident that Vin Diesel loves this character, and David Twohy clearly loves this universe. They spent more than 20 years continuously trying to push Riddick forward, even when studios kept pulling back. That kind of long-term commitment from a major actor is genuinely unusual. Most stars would have abandoned the franchise after Chronicles lost money, but Diesel, instead of leaving, kept fighting for it. And despite all the instability, the legacy of the franchise is actually pretty strong. Pitch Black especially has aged extremely well. Even now, it still works as a tight sci-fi horror movie because the simplicity of the setup kept everything focused. The creature design was effective, the pacing moved quickly, and Riddick remained compelling because the movie never fully domesticated him into a traditional hero. The games also still have a great reputation. Escape from Butcher Bay in particular is constantly remembered as one of the greatest licensed games ever made, and even Chronicles has developed something of a cult reevaluation over the years. A lot of sci-fi fans now appreciate the movie's weird ambition far more than audiences did back in 2004. especially when watching the director's cut. But at the same time, it's impossible not to look at this franchise and think about what could have been, because Riddick himself really is one of the most unique sci-fi action characters of his generation. He wasn't a clean superhero. He wasn't even a perfect savior. He was just violent, selfish, strange, and almost animalistic in the way that he survived. And now, there are not many mainstream sci-fi protagonists who feel like that anymore. Somehow, despite having an iconic character, a loyal fan base, critically respected games, and a dedicated creative team, the franchise has spent most of its existence trapped between cult status and blockbuster ambition without ever fully settling into either one. And that was the real tragedy of the Chronicles of Riddick franchise. It wasn't that one sequel underperformed, or that Furia took forever to get made, but that a genuinely great sci-fi character never received the stable, long-term franchise support he probably deserved. So, as of right now, Riddick Furia has been officially announced with David Twohy and Vin Diesel both returning, and production was scheduled to begin in August 2024. International sales have reportedly been completed, but a North American distributor still has not been confirmed, and there is still no official release date. So, the future of the franchise remains uncertain yet again. And, honestly, that uncertainty feels completely fitting for Riddick, as this series has survived entirely through persistence. One cult hit, one massive financial disappointment, one comeback movie funded partly through personal risk, and one fourth film that took over a decade just to reach production. The weird thing is that through all of that chaos, people still care about Riddick, and that says a lot about how strong the character actually was. Anyway guys, that is what happened to the Chronicles of Riddick franchise. Let us know in the comments which Riddick movie is your favorite, and honestly, do you think Riddick Furia will actually make it all the way to release? And also tell us what other science fiction franchises stuck in development hell you would want us to cover next. Till next time!